How did Dana White and the UFC let go of one of its most dominant champions ever? And how did Dana White discredit his value on the way out? It's a mess. I got all the tea you want to see, so keep watching to find out. This year hasn't been kind to the UFC so far, with Dana White slapping his wife on New Year's Eve, to now the news breaking that they have released the most intriguing and dangerous heavyweight champions on the planet, probably since Brock Lesnar and Francis Ngannou. Now, to truly understand what happened, we have to go back a few years to 2021 when Francis Ngannou defeated Stipe Miocic back at UFC 260 in convincing fashion. And in the post-fight interview, Francis Ngannou called for a fight against Jon Jones, which at that time would have broken records. It would have been probably the biggest fight in UFC history to make at that time, and still it could be that now. However, Jon Jones needed time to get up to heavyweight. He wanted to bulk up enough to get in heavyweight condition and just needed more time, and the UFC was waiting on Jon Jones, and Jon Jones had a contract negotiation issue with the UFC himself, wanting $10 million, and people seem to sweep that under the rug, especially with this breaking news coming to the forefront. So fast forward to 2022, early 2022, a year ago, Francis Ngannou takes on Ciryl Gane for the undisputed heavyweight championship of the world. Now, the stigma going into this fight was that Francis Ngannou has fought every fight on his UFC contract. He fulfilled his duties, and this was going to be his last fight on the contract. Whether or not he was going to stay with the UFC, go box, no one knew. However, this was the big fight to truly get Francis what he wanted. He wanted leverage. He wanted freedom to do whatever he wanted, yet still be under the UFC banner. And before the Ciryl Gane fight happened, everyone was asking, have you worked out a new deal with Dana White and the UFC? People were asking Dana, have you worked out a new deal with Francis? And they were sweeping that under the rug because, again, we still had a fight to be fought. So the fight happened, and Francis Ngannou defeated Ciryl Gane. First two rounds were very close. Francis lost those first two rounds. They were dicey. But then Francis gutted it out and won the next three rounds by completely out-grappling Ciryl Gane, a la Mark Coleman, a la Daniel Cormier, and put a stamp on, not only am I the best heavyweight in the world, but I now have leverage and I now have the UFC by the balls. And even more so, what made this victory even more emphatic and more glorious is that he did this on one fucking leg. He had a knee injury, tore his knee completely apart in training. He completely was thinking about pulling out of the fight. Doctors told him he should pull out of the fight, but instead he gutted it out and defeated probably one of the most talented heavyweights on the UFC roster. I made a video saying how Francis Ngannou exposed the UFC and had him by the tail. You should definitely go watch it. It's worth a watch because it definitely pertains into what I'm talking about now and what this video is made of. And mind you, over the past year, the Ciryl Gane fight happened a year ago, 2022, January 23rd, 2022. And ever since then, both sides have been absolutely radio silent on this entire situation. So no one knew what was going to happen. So then we get to last Saturday. Someone at T-Mobile Arena. In my eyes, it is the world's most famous arena and the greatest, coolest arena in the country. Forget Madison Square Garden. Two of the biggest fights in both boxing and MMA happen at T-Mobile Arena, not Madison Square Garden. So someone at the world's most famous, greatest arena, T-Mobile Arena, released a poster stating Jon Jones versus Ciryl Gane will be fighting March 4th, UFC 285 for the undisputed heavyweight championship of the world. And it was a little funny situation because they're like, hey, should I release this poster? They're like, no, we got to wait word on the UFC. What? Okay, I'm going to put it on right now. No, don't do it. And he did. And if you know anything on why Ariel Helwani got kicked out of the UFC, basically, is that he released news in regards to Brock Lesnar returning. If you are Dana White, you're absolutely fuming at this. But yet, if it's not one of your employers releasing this news, or yourself for that matter, you're absolutely fucking pissed at that. Because again, he feels like it's fake news. If it's not coming from him or one of his employers, it doesn't mean shit. So this happened at T-Mobile Arena, and 5 hours later, Dana White is like, okay, I guess that's true. Yeah, Jon Jones and Cyril Gane are fighting for the vacant heavyweight championship. Oh, and by the way, it's not because Francis Ngannou was hurt. It's because he's released from the UFC entirely. And many people took that as, wow, that actually happened. We all thought they were going to make a deal and get the UFC back under control with the most popular division in all of sports, having the most popular champion in all of sports at the helm. But that didn't happen. And the news of Francis being released from the UFC completely overshadowed the news of Jon Jones's return, of Leon Edwards' Kamaru Usman 3 being announced for London 2 weeks after the Jon Jones-Cyril Gane fight. And it honestly made me sad. It made me very, very sad because I love Francis Ngannou. He's one of my all-time favorite fighters, definitely in my top 5. He is the physical embodiment of what you would want in a champion. Not only does he look like a Marvel superhero, but what he's been through. He was in the gutter, and that's an understatement. He spent many nights in jail trying to flee his country of Cameroon. He was homeless, sleeping on park benches, sleeping in parking garages, those stairwells and parking garages. He was sleeping there. To go into France and finally finding his potential and wanting to be not an MMA fighter, but a boxer. He fell in love with MMA because he realized there was more money in MMA. And for him to be released and for him to not have the opportunity that many others deserve is truly, it's very, very sad. And it's something you don't want to see, especially for that man and for everything he's been through. Now, for the reason why I'm making this video today is because of what Dana White said in the press conference. And basically all he said was Francis Ngannou left. He said 2 things. Francis Ngannou left because he wants to fight lesser talent. I find that to be an absolute bold-faced lie, because when has Francis Ngannou turned down a challenge? He avenged his loss to Stipe Miocic, who dominated Francis in their first fight. He wasn't the same for a while after that first Stipe fight, because after that Stipe fight, he had one of the worst fights of all time against Derek Lewis, in which he was absolutely gun shy to pull the trigger, no pun intended, against Derek Lewis. So he avenged his loss to Stipe in the most emphatic way possible. Then he fought one of the most talented and skillful heavyweights on the roster in Cyril Gane on one freaking leg. He defeated him on one leg. Not only that, he's been calling out Jon Jones for the longest time, asking him to fight. And many people are not throwing the blame on Jon Jones when they absolutely should. Jon Jones did not need 3 freaking years to bulk up to heavyweight. No, he needed maybe 1, 2 at the latest. He did not need 3 years to bulk up to heavyweight. This fight could have happened in 2022. But no, Jon Jones was playing the game himself, and people seem to forget that. So Dana White said he wants to fight lesser competition. You mean make more money? Granted, PFL might talk to him. Granted, Bellator might talk to him. Granted, BKFC, as crazy as they are, might talk to Francis and offer him all the money in the world. But in the end, what does Francis want to do? He wants to box. His first love is boxing. His first love is going to be boxing. His first love is going to step in that ring. And at the end, that's what he wants to do, is box. Another thing, there's a lot more money in boxing than there is UFC. Why do you think Tyron Woodley went and fought Jake Paul? Why do you think Anderson Silva went and boxed for professional boxing fights and said he made more money doing boxing than he did UFC as one of the longest reigning UFC champions in history? That's what he wants to do. And all Francis wanted to do was have the freedom to go box like Conor McGregor did, but still be under the UFC banner. Now, I get that there's a big caveat. When Conor McGregor went and boxed Floyd Mayweather, that was the time where the UFC sold the company and they needed more money. They needed to kind of get reestablished as the top premier destination for all MMA. With now Francis wanting to go box and still be under the banner of the UFC, it's kind of like them saying, nah, we're good. We're signed with ESPN. We're signed with all these other endeavors that make us more money than ever before. We don't need you to go box. We've tried that. We're good on that. And that's not fair, because you're letting the world's biggest star in all of sports do it, and you can't let your heavyweight champion do it and make all the money in the world. And by the way, probably send the UFC into another stratosphere. That just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And now the second thing Dana White was saying at the press conference that really irked me was that we were going to pay Francis Ngannou more money than we paid Brock Lesnar. Brock Lesnar was the cash cow of the UFC in the late 2000s, early 2010s, UFC heavyweight champion. Now, I wouldn't say it bothers me. I'll backtrack a bit. I wouldn't say that bothers me, but how do we know that's true? How do we know that's true? Dana White said that they met up in dinner many times, over a ton of dinners, his words, over 1 million it seemed like, and they still couldn't come to an agreement. With Dana White saying that you can't bounce back from hitting a woman, that's absolutely true. But I feel like one way he could have kind of earned everyone's respect back is by re-signing Francis Ngannou and letting him do whatever he wants while still being a part of the UFC. And with that not happening, I think it's truly unfair. And I hope Francis gets his payday because he deserves it. We've seen this happen before where Dana White tried to disregard everything any fighter has done as they were leaving the UFC. A perfect example is Nate Diaz. They give Nate Diaz Khamzat Chimaev to the point where they want to taint his legacy on the UFC so bad that it ruins his value wherever he goes. But it all worked out in Nate Diaz's favor in the end. In the end, I think this will work out for Francis Ngannou too. I'd say he goes and does maybe 3 or 4 boxing fights. I don't think he does MMA for a while, but I do think he does revisit with UFC after he gets all his money, and he goes back to try and prove a point to everybody that, hey, I'm still the best and I'm still the champion. No one ever took that belt away from me, and he will be the uncrowned champ until someone beats him. And I do think they will revisit with each other, but we'll see. It'll be interesting to see where he goes, but I say in the next 3 years or so, Francis Ngannou very well might be back in the UFC, or they will at least revisit and try and mend the fences. I want to thank you guys for liking and subscribing to today's video. Let me know what you think about this entire situation in the comment section below. It's your boy, the Mexican Mohican. Keep it 100. Hollywood AJ. I'm out. I'll see you in the next one.